Hi, Blackhouse Bay Baptist Church and friends. Welcome to another gathering on the 6th of March, 2022. Remember, we're seeking to meet Jesus in our study of Mark's Gospel. Not only to know about him, but to know him, so we can choose whether we want to put our faith in him for salvation, transformation, and ultimately for hope in his guidance and direction for this life and for the next. So, what is he doing and what's he inviting us into? Today we're going to jump past Mark chapter 5 and 6, which do cover some pretty amazing things: healings, resurrection, feeding. Need to have a read, but we're going to talk about chapter 7. When you look at chapter 7, you realize it's a pretty complex conversation that has to do with something that's historically distant from us. So to think about it, we want to think in three questions. What's going on? What does it mean? And what is Jesus inviting us into with him and his kingdom? First, what's going on? Well, it's a question of cleanliness. It's a question of how to understand what there was the thought about law and food and being clean before God so you could enter his presence. And Jesus responds to the Pharisees' concern about his disciples eating with unwashed hands with a reply from Isaiah 29, where he says, "Oh, your hearts are far from me. You worship in vain. You follow the teachings of man so that you can avoid the commands of God." That's pretty challenging. So he goes on to illustrate this by this idea of how they avoided honoring father and mother by particular vows. So they were doing one thing that seemed to honor God in order to not honor God, which was putting them in this bind. Now, not everybody was doing that. So Jesus answers that question and says, here's what you've done. Now let me go back to that, what makes you clean or unclean, and says, in a parable, nothing outside a person can defile by going in, but rather what comes out defiles. And in this, then, Jesus, again, speaks in a parable, which is something is meant to invite people in, but also points out that when people reject, they're rejecting God's kingdom also. So what do we do with it? Does this kingdom seed take root? Jesus goes away and explains to the disciples that this is a significant shift in the way that we're to understand how we operate with food, and also what we think about where our acceptance before God comes into play, whether it's food and cleanliness on the outside or the heart on the inside. And to demonstrate the reality of what Jesus is saying, that he goes on and does ministry to the Gentiles, which is really at the core of what he's saying. So what's going on is this, again, historical conversation about food and Old Testament law and tradition that Jesus is shifting. So what does it mean? Two things. One is that Jesus himself is taking on God-like role and power and the ability to change the way that we understand how you're supposed to relate to him and the law. He's getting after it through this tradition that gets sideways or sidetracked. And so we see that Jesus, in his insightful interaction, engagement, his challenge to the scribes and Pharisees, that he is reordering how we understand how to relate to God. So again, taking on those roles of Son of God, Son of Man, Christ the Lord. And he's doing that knowing what he's going to do on the cross and in resurrection. But here again, we're seeing the journey unfold before us. So we have to realize Jesus is opening up something to us that will happen because of his cross and resurrection. So Jesus is amazing in what he's doing. And what he's doing, though, is changing the way that we operate before God, which means that anybody and everybody now can come into God's presence. They don't have to be ritually clean by washings or by food that they eat. They're not dirty by those things, but they're dirty by what comes out of the heart. And he's already gotten after that if we come with a humility of heart, there is an openness. But these are the things that actually make us clean. These evil thoughts, these evil considerations, sexual immorality, theft, murder, these things that come out that change the way that we act. So what does that mean for us? Well, we've enjoyed the benefits of this for a long time in eating what we want and realizing that we can be a people of God without thinking too much about this. But the two things that stand out are this. One, we as Christians also can get caught up in traditions that keep us from following what God wants us to do from the heart. So we need to reflect on that. And two, we have to realize that when Jesus opens up for the meal to be a place of welcome for both Jews and Gentiles, we also need to realize that food is something that we do all the time that is not meant just for us, but it's meant as a welcome. So my homework again for you is to reconsider who you're welcoming with food, and then to discuss about tradition and how Jesus wants us to understand heart versus tradition. So peace as you discuss. May God bless you in your time together.